South Africa is preparing to assume the G20 presidency next month, and the country is expected to play a vital role at the upcoming G20 summit next week in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Let's look ahead to the summit now and the expectations of it. I'm joined by Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Let me thank you very much for your time. Tired as you are, you only arrived a couple of hours ago from Brazil. Give us a sense of the mood as officials, academics, experts like you have been gathering over the last while to prepare inputs, of course, to next week's summit in Rio. How are people feeling like? How optimistic are they? And what are the issues in the main?
Yeah. So good afternoon, Vuyo. Yes, and I just landed back from Rio, where I was attending the Think 20 summit, which is one of the engagement groups of the G20, and indeed at the same time there was a Civil 20 happening, which is another of the engagement groups. All of these engagement groups are coming together at the end of the Brazilian presidency to put together and to present their proposals. So certainly not something that they haven't presented to the official G20 track in the past, but this really is the culmination of the Brazilian presidency. So Rio, of course, is where the summit is happening. It's been coined the G20 capital of Brazil. There's a lot of preparation happening at the moment, both logistically and, of course, in terms of content on the official track. Really finalizing the leaders' declaration, which will hopefully come out at the end of the summit. I think if we reflect back on a couple of years ago, if we think back to the Indonesian presidency, when there were difficulties, it was a few months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there were really some challenges there in terms of the phraseology of the communique. I think over the last couple of years, under both the Indonesians and the Indians, that has been sort of managed. And certainly there is a conviction that, we will have a declaration that everybody can sign on to. In terms of the Brazilian priorities, of course, Brazil has really taken its domestic issues and put them squarely on the agenda. And these domestic issues are not just Brazilian. Of course, they reflect a lot of the challenges that many countries in the global south face. Its biggest theme has been that of fighting inequality, poverty, and hunger. And what the leaders will sign on to during the summit is a global alliance against poverty and hunger, which is something that has really been one of the pillars of the Brazilian presidency this year. It's intended to create a platform for bringing together innovative ideas around how countries around the world have dealt with poverty and hunger, and also to create financial instruments in order for countries to be able to implement some of these ideas or take these ideas and modify them. That the Brazilians have also put on the agenda the issue of climate action. We know that particularly for Brazil, more broadly, the sustainability agenda is something that is very close to Brazil's heart. We mustn't forget that the Amazon is in Brazil. It's one of the lungs of the world, and there has been a lot done in the area of environmental and climate action during the Lula presidency. And then lastly, of course, their big agenda item around the reform of global governance. And we saw some of those discussions and the direction that they wanted to take it come out of the UN meetings earlier in September, I think they were, around calling for a review of the UN Charter, which is provided for, but nobody has actually ever done it. So those have been the three priorities. We'll probably see them very clearly articulated in the declaration. And then, of course, there are many other issues that will also be reflected. But those are really the highlights.
So it goes without saying then that that declaration that the world's leaders will sign off on will no doubt inform the agenda that South Africa is going to pursue in the 200 or so meetings that it's going to convene and run over the next year. How prepared are we for the presidency of the G20?
Yes, well, you're quite correct that the way in which South Africa sees this is really to build, and in fact, indeed, all presidencies aim to build on the legacy of their predecessors, and you've seen with the number of issues. For example, if we look at multilateral development banks and the push to increase their ability to scale up their ability to lend more money in order to be able to come closer to achieving the SDGs by 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, each country has built on that. So, the building blocks were started 3 or 4 years ago, and, the process has moved steadily on. There's been a great deal of engagement between the South African the incoming South African presidency and the Brazilian presidency over the course of this year. As you can imagine, there are a lot of issues that both South Africa and Brazil hold dear from a socioeconomic developmental perspective, and so there is a natural progression. And if you look at the three key the sort of the tagline of the South African presidency as announced is really it's solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Really, very strongly building on what the Brazilians have highlighted. And I must also add, it's not just the Brazilians. We have had 3 consecutive Global South presidencies of the G20, with South Africa being the 4th, and that has focused the G20 really quite squarely on the issues that are close to developing countries' hearts, which is that of development. South Africa, over the course of the year, has really been working across the departments. National departments to prepare. Obviously, each of the working groups, each of the departments focuses on a particular working group with their own priorities. But I think we're 2 weeks away from taking over the presidency, and I think everything is sort of in motion and ready to take off, so to speak.
Well, I was going to, when you mentioned the financial instruments and all of that, because, your IMFs have come and the World Bank as well, a lot of criticisms as to how they get to decide what to do with who and how and so on. But in the interest of time, I want to talk about something that has been on the lips of many people as well, which is what has been happening. The Russia-Ukraine situation, but also what has been happening in the Middle East in particular, given the fact that we are going to take over the presidency of the G20. To what extent our standpoint, which some people reckon is not, is a bit ambivalent, maybe is the word I should say, but also the fact that South Africa took Israel to the ICJ, to what extent those issues will influence, one, discussions in Rio and beyond, but also, or in particular, the fact that South Africa will be taking over the presidency of the G20.
So as you probably know, Vuyo, there's always a section in the Leaders' Declaration that focuses on some of the bigger geopolitical issues. And that's unavoidable when you get the leaders of 21 countries and regions, because of course now the AU as well as the EU are members of the G20. So it's inevitable that you're going to focus on politics. But I want to just open a parenthesis here and say that of course the G20, when it was elevated to a leader summit, is fundamentally about global economic governance. But of course, the politics does come into it, and we saw that very clearly. And as I alluded to in 2022, there will be something in the declaration around both Ukraine, I have no doubt, or the broader geopolitical issues, as well as maybe a reference to what's happening in the Middle East. I would argue that in Gaza and Israel, our stance isn't ambivalent. I think it's quite clear. Perhaps with Ukraine and with the African Peace Initiative, I think that stance has changed over time and modified. What the leaders, and certainly the Brazilians and the South Africans and the Indians and the Indonesians over the course of the last 3 years have worked on, is to make sure that the way in which the declaration's wording is agreed doesn't create a situation where where countries will not sign on. The worst thing that can happen from a G20 perspective, or indeed any of these big global meetings, is that you come out of it without a declaration because people have decided that they don't want to sign up to it because of the wording. So both the Indonesians and the Indians worked hard with, I have to add, with Brazilian and South African support last year to make sure that the wording was, that everybody could sign on to it. I think the thinking is pretty similar this year, and certainly South Africa will go into its presidency in that way. I think both South Africa and other developing countries believe that the G20 should not become an arena where the geopolitical contestation becomes the primary objective, because that then destroys what the G20 is supposed to be achieving, which is bringing together global North, global South to tackle joint global challenges. And if we allow the geopolitics to completely take over the agenda, then all of those very important issues like climate change, like more broadly development, let's put that all under that sustainable development umbrella. All of those will be, put to the one side, and we actually really can't afford, not only as countries but also as a planet, for these things to not really be discussed and for us not to be able to cooperate with them. To cooperate together. The one thing that I just one last thing for you. Of course, next year we will be. The Troika will be Brazil, South Africa, and the US. And under obviously a new US administration, I think there are potentially some challenges there in terms of how we navigate that space.
Just as a quick parting shot, seriously run out of time, but still taking my liberties, Elizabeth. A lot has been said by the president, by the Minister of International Relations, and I've heard a couple of experts talking about this as well. Just how pivotal a moment beckons for South Africa's diplomatic efforts. Is this episode, in other words, symbolically taking over the presidency of the G20 next week, and of course over the next year or so having these 200 or so meetings running with it all the way until the next G20 summit? Does it necessarily press the reset button when it comes to South Africa's approach to international affairs and South Africa's place under the sun?
No, absolutely, Vuyo. Although I would say that South Africa has always been a very active, I call it an active global citizen. It may have gone through some troughs, but I think generally, out of the entire continent, I would say, South Africa is one of those leaders of the continent in terms of global governance. And chairing the G20, of course, at this particular juncture gives it an opportunity in the same way that it's done for Brazil and in the same way it's done for India and Indonesia before them, although Indonesia also had to deal with the pandemic. It's an opportunity to really shine, to be seen as, firstly, to be able to manage, to organize a really successful G20, because it is such a huge undertaking. It's nothing like we've done before. But secondly, also to push things on the global agenda that are important for the South and South Africa, the continent, but you have to do it in a way that builds consensus and builds bridges. And South Africa, historically, since 1994, has been able to do that in a number of areas. And so this is really an opportunity for South Africa to put its best foot forward. I think it's done a lot of the homework in this regard, and to really try to build bridges in a very, very difficult geopolitical context, where cooperation, though, is something that we cannot forfeit because we can't afford it.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for talking to us, and thank you for sacrificing your time, having just landed from Brazil, where that G20 summit will be taking place next week.